Some say fate has a peculiar way of bringing souls together. On a bitter winter morning in Montana Territory, 1885, Sarah McAllister finds a wealthy stranger collapsed on her cabin porch, a man whose arrogant reputation preceded him across 3 counties. With her neighbor's nearest homestead 5 miles away and a blizzard approaching, she's forced to drag him inside. But in these frontier lands, old laws still hold sway. Any unmarried woman harboring a man under her roof must wed him or face exile. As Sarah tends to his wounds, whispers spread through the territory about the stranger in the widow's cabin, setting in motion events that neither could have foreseen. But as the wealthy stranger fights for his life in her care, a question haunts the whispers around town. Did Sarah McAllister truly save him out of kindness, or did she orchestrate the perfect trap to claim his fortune? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of Thomas's wedding ring hung heavy against Sarah McAllister's collarbone as she trudged through the pre-dawn darkness toward her barn. 5 years had passed since she'd threaded it onto the silver chain around her neck, yet some mornings, like today, it felt as heavy as the day the pastor had pressed it into her trembling hands at the funeral. Dawn painted the Montana sky in watercolor strokes of purple and gold, the familiar scent of pine and frost filling her lungs. Her boots crunched across the frozen ground as she made her way to the barn door, its weathered planks groaning there in daily protest as she heaved it open. Inside, the warmth of sleeping cattle and sweet hay enveloped her like an old friend's embrace. "Morning, old girl," she murmured to Bessie, her most reliable milk cow. The animal's dark eyes caught the lantern, light as Sarah settled onto her wooden stool, allowing herself a moment to lean against the cow's warm flank. These quiet moments before sunrise were sometimes the only peace she found anymore. The routine was as familiar as breathing. Check the animals, milk the cows, mend what needed mending. Thomas had taught her well in their 3 short years together, preparing her for a life she never thought she'd have to face alone. "A ranch wife needs to know everything her husband knows," he'd always said, a wisdom that had saved her these past years, though she suspected he'd meant for those lessons to be a partnership rather than her sole survival guide. Sarah worked methodically, her mind wandering to the letter stuffed in her apron pocket. Carlton Rhodes, owner of the largest spread in the territory, had made another offer on her land yesterday. 3rd one this month, each figure higher than the last, each accompanied by the same patronizing suggestion that a woman alone couldn't possibly manage such a spread. The memory of his last visit brought a bitter taste to her mouth. He'd stood in her kitchen, hat in hands, putting on a show of grandfatherly concern. "Now, Mrs. McAllister," he'd said, "you must think of your future. What would Thomas want for you? Surely not this endless struggle." She'd wanted to tell him exactly what Thomas would have wanted, to fight for every acre they'd claimed together, every fence post they'd driven into Montana soil. Instead, she'd politely shown him the door, just as her mother had taught her. A lady, even a ranch widow, must maintain her dignity. The morning passed in a blur of familiar tasks. Sarah repaired a section of fence that the latest storm had damaged, her gloved hands working the wire with practiced efficiency. From this rise, she could see clear across her property to where it bordered Rhodes's land. The contrast was stark, his vast manicured pastures against her smaller, more rugged spread. But this land was hers, every rock and tree as familiar as the lines on her own hands. Near noon, she led her horse Thunder to the creek that marked her eastern boundary. Thomas had named the gelding, claiming the horse's grey coat reminded him of storm clouds. Now, watching Thunder drink from the creek's partially frozen surface, Sarah allowed herself to remember that day. Thomas's laugh as the young horse had pranced sideways, his strong hands adjusting her grip on the reins, the pride in his voice when she'd finally managed a clean canter. The wedding ring against her chest caught a rare beam of winter sunlight, sending a flash of gold across the snow. Sarah touched it briefly, a habit born of countless lonely moments. "I'm keeping our dream alive, Thomas," she whispered to the wind. "Even if some days, I'm not sure how." A distant wolf's howl echoed across the valley, reminding her that winter was settling in early this year. She'd need to check her supplies, ensure she had enough preserved food and firewood to weather the coming storms. The neighboring Miller family had offered to help with her winter preparations, but Sarah had declined. The Millers had 5 children of their own to worry about, and she'd learned the hard way that accepting help often came with the expectation that she'd eventually sell or remarry. As Sarah turned Thunder back toward the barn, movement caught her eye. A rider approaching from the direction of town. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle in her saddle scabbard before she recognized Ben Turner, the general store owner's son. The boy often brought mail and supplies to the outlying ranches, though his visits had grown more frequent lately, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her both sad and uncomfortable. He was a good boy, barely 20, with a sweet smile that reminded her too much of Thomas in their courting days. "Mrs. McAllister," Ben called out, waving as he drew closer. "Got some mail for you, ma'am. And Pa wanted me to remind you about the supplies you ordered. Said they'll be in next week." Sarah nodded her thanks, accepting the small bundle of letters. "That's kind of your father to send word. Please tell him I'll be in as soon as weather permits." She could feel Ben wanting to say more, perhaps offer to help with some task around the ranch, so she added gently, "I should get back to my chores before the day gets away from me." Alone again, Sarah allowed Thunder to pick his way home at his own pace while she sorted through the mail. Most were business correspondence, feed suppliers, tax notices, and another letter from Rhodes' lawyer. But one envelope, thick and creamy, bore a return address from back east. Her sister Elizabeth's elegant handwriting flowed across the paper. "Dearest Sarah, I implore you to reconsider my offer. Boston has so much to offer a widow of your youth, and father has connections with several respectable gentlemen who would be eager to meet you. This stubborn insistence on maintaining Thomas's ranch is admirable, but surely you see that it's time to begin a new chapter." Sarah tucked the letter away before finishing it, her jaw set against the familiar argument. Elizabeth meant well, but she'd never understood. This wasn't just Thomas's ranch. It was their dream, their future, the life they'd planned together. The fact that he was gone didn't change that this land was as much a part of her now as her own heartbeat. The sun was setting by the time she finished her evening chores, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of amber and rose. Sarah stood on her porch, Thomas's ring warm against her skin from a day of work, and watched the colors fade. A storm was brewing in the northwest, dark clouds gathering like wool at shearing time. She'd need to check the windows, ensure everything was battened down tight. But for now, she allowed herself this moment of stillness, breathing in the sharp winter air. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own battles to fight. For tonight, she had her memories, her determination, and the quiet satisfaction of another day survived on her own terms. The wind picked up, carrying with it the first few snowflakes of what promised to be a significant storm. Sarah took one last look at the darkening mountains before heading inside, unaware that fate was about to deliver a stranger to her door who would change everything. The storm arrived with a fury that Sarah hadn't seen since the winter that took Thomas. Wind howled through every crack in the cabin's sturdy logs, and snow fell so thick she could barely see the barn from her kitchen window. She'd just finished securing the last shutter when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A thump, followed by what might have been a groan, barely audible above the wind's wail. Sarah reached for the rifle above the mantel, her fingers finding the familiar wooden stock. The noise came again, definitely from her front porch. Wild animals sometimes sought shelter during storms, but this sounded different. When she opened the door, the sight before her stole her breath. A man lay crumpled against her porch railing, snow already accumulating on his expensive wool coat. Blood had frozen in dark patches across his chest and shoulder. "Mister?" Sarah called out, keeping the rifle ready. "Can you hear me?" The stranger stirred slightly, and something metallic clattered from his gloved hand. A brass compass, its surface etched with elaborate scrollwork. As Sarah knelt to check his pulse, her eye caught the nameplate, J. Blackwood. The name hit her like a physical blow. James Blackwood, the railroad baron's son who'd been buying up distressed ranches across 3 territories. She'd seen his photograph in the newspaper, though the unconscious man before her bore little resemblance to that arrogant portrait. "Dear Lord," she whispered, recognizing the gravity of her situation. To leave him would mean certain death in this weather. To help him meant inviting scandal, or worse. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and in this storm it might as well have been 50. His pulse was weak but steady under her fingers. Blood seeped from what appeared to be a bullet wound in his shoulder, and his skin felt like ice. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, knowing her next actions would change everything. "I must be losing my mind," she muttered, setting down the rifle. It took all her strength to drag him inside, his boots leaving twin trails in the snow. The compass she tucked into her apron pocket, an afterthought that would later prove fateful. Near the fireplace, she managed to prop him into a sitting position. His head lolled forward, revealing a gash at his hairline. As she worked to remove his frozen coat, a leather-bound book fell from an inner pocket. It landed open, revealing columns of numbers and names. A business ledger, its pages stained with both ink and blood. Sarah's eyes caught familiar names: Rhodes Carlton, Miller Estate, Turner Holdings. Next to each was a figure that made her heart skip. These weren't just random numbers, they were debts, massive ones, all owed to Blackwood's banking interests. "So that's why they're all so eager to sell," she whispered, pieces falling into place. Rhodes's persistent offers, the Millers' sudden decision to move east, old Turner's nervous behavior whenever loans were mentioned, it all led back to the man bleeding on her floor. A violent shiver ran through Blackwood's body, reminding Sarah of more immediate concerns. She could puzzle over ledgers later. Right now, she needed to save this man's life, regardless of who he was or what he represented. Working quickly, she cut away his blood-soaked shirt, revealing the bullet wound. The bleeding had slowed, likely from the cold, but infection would set in if she didn't clean it properly. She'd learned enough from Thomas's ranch accidents to know this would require stitching. As she gathered her medical supplies, needle, thread, her precious bottle of whiskey for sterilizing, Sarah's mind raced through the implications of her actions. Once word got out that she'd harbored a man under her roof, especially this man, the gossip would spread faster than wildfire. Her reputation, carefully maintained these 5 years of widowhood, would be ruined. "You better be worth all this trouble, Mr. Blackwood," she muttered, threading her needle by firelight. The whiskey splashed over his wound, but he didn't stir. A blessing given what came next. The stitching took nearly an hour, her fingers working carefully by lamplight as the storm raged outside. When she finally finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. Blackwood's breathing had steadied, though fever flushed his cheeks. Dawn was still hours away, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Sarah pulled a chair close to the fire, keeping watch over her unexpected patient. The ledger lay where it had fallen, its pages seeming to mock her with their revelations. In her apron pocket, the brass compass caught the firelight, its needle swinging faithfully north despite everything. Sarah turned it over in her hands, studying the fine engraving. Below Blackwood's name was an inscription: "May you always find your way home. Home." Sarah glanced around her cabin. The home she'd built with Thomas. The home she'd fought to keep. The home that now harbored a man who represented everything she'd been fighting against. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if nature itself were laughing at the irony of her situation. Come morning, she'd have decisions to make. But for now, she could only wait, watching the rise and fall of James Blackwood's chest and wondering if saving his life would cost her everything she held dear. The ledger's pages rustled in a draft, drawing her attention again. Sarah picked it up, telling herself she was merely securing it from the wind. But as she closed it, her eyes caught more familiar names, more staggering figures. This book held the financial fate of half the territory, and now it was in her hands, along with its unconscious owner. "What am I going to do with you, Mr. Blackwood?" she whispered to his sleeping form. The fire crackled in response, offering no answers, only the promise of a long night ahead. The storm broke just before noon the next day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, stealing glances at her still unconscious guest, while she kneaded bread dough with more force than necessary. The fever hadn't broken, but at least his breathing remained steady. A flash of movement caught her eye, riders approaching through the fresh snow. Her hands froze in the dough as she recognized Ben Turner's blue scarf, accompanied by his father's broad-brimmed hat. They weren't due to deliver supplies for another week. Sarah quickly threw a quilt over Blackwood's still form and wiped her hands on her apron. The brass compass pressed against her hip from its hiding place in her pocket as she opened the door. "Mrs. McAllister!" Old Turner called out, his usual friendly tone carrying an odd edge. "Thought we'd check on you after that fearsome storm." His eyes darted past her to the cabin's interior. "That's very kind, but I managed just fine." Sarah stepped onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. "Though I wouldn't say no to help clearing the path to the barn later." Ben shifted in his saddle. "We saw tracks leading to your door, Mom. Fresh ones before the storm hit." His young face showed genuine concern. "With all the strangers passing through lately?" Sarah's heart thundered against her ribs. But years of poker games with Thomas had taught her to keep her expression neutral. "Probably my own tracks. I had to secure the shutters before the worst hit." Old Turner cleared his throat. "Sarah, if there's anything you need to tell us—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The territory's got laws about unmarried women harboring men. Laws meant to protect proper folks' reputations, you understand." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down Sarah's spine. She'd heard of the old frontier marriage law, but surely it was outdated, a relic from rougher times. "I appreciate your concern," she said firmly, "but I assure you—" A crash from inside the cabin cut her off. Sarah's heart stopped as both Turners stiffened in their saddles. "Just my cat," she offered weakly, knowing they'd never seen a cat on her property. Old Turner dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. "Sarah, as town registrar, it's my duty to inform you that if a man's found under your roof, the law's quite clear. Marriage or exile from the territory. No exceptions. Mr. Turner, surely in this day and age, times may be changing back east," he interrupted, "but out here, reputation is everything. You know that better than most." His voice softened. "We respect how you've carried on after Thomas, but if word gets out—" Another sound from inside, this time unmistakably human. Ben's eyes widened, and Sarah knew the game was up. "I think," Old Turner said heavily, "you'd better show us inside." Sarah's mind raced. The ledger was hidden under her mattress, but Blackwood himself was evidence enough. As she reached for the door handle, a memory surfaced. Thomas reading from the territory's founding documents one winter evening. "Some of these old laws," he'd mused, "seem ridiculous now, but they shaped this land for better or worse." The door creaked open. Sarah held her breath as the Turners stepped past her, their boots leaving melting snow on her clean floor. Both men froze at the sight of the unconscious figure by the fire. "Good Lord," Old Turner whispered, recognition dawning on his weathered face. "That's James Blackwood." Ben took a step forward. "He's hurt bad, Pa. Look at those bandages." "I found him half dead on my porch," Sarah said quietly. "Would you have left him to freeze?" Old Turner removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "No, course not. But this complicates things considerably." He pulled a worn leather book from his coat, the town registry. "You know I'll have to report this. Word's bound to spread anyway, and if we don't handle it properly—" Sarah touched Thomas's ring through her dress, drawing strength from it. "How long do I have to make a decision?" "Until he's well enough to travel. Then either wedding bells Or walking papers, he paused. Unless, unless he doesn't survive his injuries, though looking at your handiwork with those bandages, I'd say you've given him a fighting chance. Sarah caught the hint of admiration in his tone. She'd earned respect in this community through years of self-sufficiency. Now that very strength might cost her everything. Does the law specify who must initiate the marriage claim? She asked. An idea forming. Old Turner consulted his registry. No, just states that if a man's found under an unmarried woman's roof, they must wed, or she must leave the territory. Some folks say it was meant to prevent impropriety. Others say it was to help widows find protection. He gave her a meaningful look, or perhaps to give them a choice in the matter. Sarah felt the weight of the compass in her pocket, remembering the figures in Blackwood's ledger. A plan began to take shape. Dangerous, perhaps foolish, but possibly her only chance to protect everything she'd built. Then I suppose, she said carefully, when he wakes, I'll have a decision to make. Ben looked between his father and Sarah, clearly troubled. But Mrs. McAllister, surely there's another way. Ben, Old Turner cut him off with a warning glance. To Sarah, he said, we'll keep this quiet as long as we can, but you know how news travels out here. Sarah nodded, already hearing the whispers that would spread through church pews and general store aisles. By sunset, half the territory would know that the widow McAllister had a man under her roof. By tomorrow, they'd know it was James Blackwood himself. After the Turners left, Sarah sank into her rocking chair, Thomas's ring a familiar comfort against her chest. In the fading daylight, she watched Blackwood's fevered breathing and allowed herself to acknowledge the full weight of her situation. She could marry a stranger, the very man whose financial empire threatened her neighbors, or abandon the land she'd fought so hard to keep, unless she found a third option, one hidden in the pages of that blood-stained ledger, or perhaps in the inscription on a brass compass that spoke of finding one's way home. Sarah was grinding herbs in her grandmother's medicine box when James Blackwood finally opened his eyes. 3 days of tending his fever with willow bark tea and honey-soaked yarrow had left her exhausted, but her vigilance had paid off. The wound showed no signs of infection, and his color had improved steadily. Where? His voice cracked, barely a whisper. His hand went instinctively to his shoulder, finding the clean bandages there. Don't try to move, Mr. Blackwood. Sarah set aside her mortar and pestle. You've been shot, and you nearly froze to death on my porch. His eyes, a startling shade of gray, focused on her with sudden clarity. You know who I am? Everyone this side of the Missouri knows James Blackwood. She poured a cup of water, helping him lift his head to drink. Though I suspect the man who shot you knew you best of all. Blackwood coughed, spilling a few drops on the quilt. My compass is safe. Sarah patted her pocket. Along with your rather interesting ledger. That got his attention. He tried to sit up, hissing in pain at the movement. You had no right to save your life, or to see the proof of how you've been squeezing every ranch in the territory? Sarah kept her voice level, though her hands shook slightly as she checked his bandages. I'd say finding a bleeding man on my property gives me certain rights, Mr. Blackwood. He watched her work, his expression guarded. You have gentle hands for someone so sharp-tongued, Mrs. McAllister. Sarah McAllister. Recognition flickered across his face. The widow who won't sell. The widow who can't be bought, she corrected, perhaps more sharply than necessary. Though now I understand why my neighbors have been so eager to unload their land. Your interest rates are criminal. A ghost of his reported arrogance surfaced in his smile. Business is business, Mrs. McAllister, though I doubt you'd understand. The complexities of watching families lose their homes, of seeing good people driven to desperate acts. She stood abruptly, crossing to her herb box. I understand plenty, Mr. Blackwood, including the fact that someone wanted you dead badly enough to risk hanging for it. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her as she measured out more willow bark for his fever. Sarah felt his gaze like a physical touch, but refused to look up from her work. You could have left me out there, he said finally. Yes, Why didn't you? Sarah paused, the herbs forgotten in her hands. Because my husband taught me that we don't measure the worth of a life by the way it's been lived, but by what it might yet become. She met his eyes steadily. Even yours, Mr. Blackwood. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. Before he could respond, a knock at the door made them both freeze. Sarah, Ben Turner's voice carried through the wood. Pa sent me to check on you, and your guest. Blackwood's hand gripped her wrist as she moved toward the door. Wait, trust me, she said quietly, removing his hand, or don't. But remember who's been keeping you alive these past days. She opened the door just wide enough to speak with Ben, but the young man's eyes went straight to Blackwood's conscious form by the fire. He's awake then, Ben said, his face falling slightly. Pa will want to know. The council's been asking. Tell them he's still recovering. Sarah stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. And Ben, thank you for being discreet these past days. The boy nodded, scuffing his boot in the snow. Just be careful, Mrs. McAllister. People are talking about the law, about what it means that you've got him here. After Ben rode away, Sarah stood on the porch longer than necessary, gathering her thoughts. When she returned inside, Blackwood was attempting to stand. You'll tear those stitches, she warned, hurrying to steady him as he swayed. What law? He demanded, gripping her shoulder for support. What are people saying? Sarah hesitated, then helped him back to his makeshift bed. There's an old territorial law about unmarried women harboring men under their roof. His face went pale, though whether from the news or the exertion was hard to tell. What kind of law? The kind that ends in either marriage or exile. Sarah busied herself adjusting his bandages, avoiding his shocked stare. So you see, Mr. Blackwood, you're not the only one whose life changed the night you collapsed on my porch. He was quiet so long that she thought he might have passed out again. But when she finally looked at his face, she found him watching her with an unreadable expression. Call me James, he said softly. If we're to be having this conversation, you might as well use my Christian name. Sarah almost smiled. Rest now, James. We can discuss our mutual predicament when you're stronger. She turned away to prepare more willow bark tea, feeling his eyes on her back. The weight of Thomas's ring seemed heavier than usual against her chest, and she wondered what her late husband would make of this situation. Somehow she suspected he might be laughing. He'd always said God had a peculiar sense of humor. Mrs. McAllister, James called as she reached the kitchen. My compass. Might I see it? Sarah touched the brass object in her pocket, remembering. The inscription about finding one's way home. After a moment's hesitation, she placed it in his outstretched hand. Their fingers brushed briefly, and something electric passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how their fates had become inexplicably entwined. Or maybe it was just the fever still burning in his blood, making his eyes shine with an intensity that caught her off guard. Either way, Sarah McAllister knew in that moment that nothing in her carefully ordered life would ever be the same again. Word spread through the territory like wildfire, carried on winter winds from homestead to homestead. By the time James could walk without assistance, a delegation from the town council had assembled in Sarah's parlor, led by Turner and his ever-present registry book. The law's clear as day, Councilman Peters declared, jabbing his finger at the relevant page. Been on our books since territorial establishment, signed by the governor himself. His jowls quivered with barely contained satisfaction. Any unmarried woman harboring a man under her roof must either wed him or leave the territory. No exceptions. Sarah stood by her fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel where Thomas's photograph watched the proceedings with frozen solemnity. James sat in her father's old armchair, his face a mask of controlled tension. Surely in this modern age, James began. Modern ain't got nothing to do with it, Peters interrupted. Law's law, especially when it concerns a woman's reputation. He cast a meaningful glance at Sarah. Begging your pardon, ma'am. Old Turner cleared his throat. There's precedent. The Jensen case of 79. The widow took in a wounded traveller. They were married by week's end, and lived happily ever after, I suppose. James's voice dripped with sarcasm. Actually, Turner said quietly, they did. Built one of the finest spreads north of the river. Sarah felt James's eyes on her, but kept her gaze fixed on Thomas's photograph. She'd spent days preparing for this moment, weighing options, studying that blood-stained ledger until its numbers danced in her dreams. There is, she said carefully, another option. All eyes turned to her. I could leave. No. James's response came so quickly it surprised them both. He stood, wincing slightly. Mrs. McAllister has built something remarkable here. I won't be the cause of her losing it. Then you understand what must be done, Peters said, satisfaction evident in his tone. Sarah turned finally, meeting James's gaze. Do you know why I won't sell to you, Mr. Blackwood? He blinked at the apparent non sequitur. I assumed it was sentiment. Your late husband. It's because this land isn't just property. It's a trust. Every family that sells to you ends up working their own land as your tenants. This valley deserves better than becoming another piece of your empire. Understanding dawned in his eyes. And now you think to use this law to protect it. I think, Sarah said carefully, that a marriage of convenience might prove convenient for us both. The council members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the romantic scene they'd anticipated. James studied her face, and she saw in his eyes the same sharp calculation she'd been practicing these past days. The lady makes an interesting proposal, he said finally, though I doubt it's what the law's framers intended. The law doesn't speak to intentions, Turner pointed out, only actions. Sarah moved to her desk, withdrew a document she'd prepared. Her contract, Mr. Blackwood, outlining terms that would protect both our interests. James took the paper, his eyebrows rising as he read. You've thought this through. I've had time during your recovery. The contract was simple but thorough. They would marry to satisfy the law, she would retain full control of her ranch, and he would restructure the crushing debts that threatened their neighbors. In return, she would help him identify who had tried to kill him, and why. This is highly irregular, Peters sputtered. These are irregular times, Sarah countered. To James, she added, your ledger shows you're losing money on these foreclosures. Nobody wins when families are driven from their land. James ran a finger along the contract's edge. And if I refuse, then I leave, as the law demands. But first I ensure every newspaper from here to Chicago receives copies of certain interesting passages from your ledger. I doubt your investors would appreciate the publicity. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You fight dirty, Mrs. McAllister. I fight to win, Mr. Blackwood. Something we have in common, I believe. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Sarah felt the weight of Thomas's ring against her chest, wondering if she was betraying his memory or honoring it in the most practical way possible. Finally, James spoke. Does anyone have a pen? Turner produced one from his coat pocket. They signed with the council as witnesses, the scratch of the pen on paper seeming unnaturally loud in the tense room. The ceremony will need to be public, Peters insisted. To satisfy propriety? Sunday after services, Turner suggested. Give folks time to travel in. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. James's signature was still drying beside hers, the ink dark against the paper like the final stroke of a complex business deal, which, she supposed, it was. As the council members filed out, James caught her arm. You're either brilliant or mad, he said softly. Perhaps both. She met his eyes steadily. But I suspect the same could be said of you, accepting such terms. You don't think I could contest this later? Once I'm recovered, you could. Sarah smiled slightly. But you won't, because deep down, Mr. Blackwood, you're as tired of this game as I am. You just needed an honorable way out. He released her arm, studying her with new respect. Sunday, then, Mrs. McAllister. Sunday, she agreed. And James, do try to look appropriately besotted. We wouldn't want to disappoint the romantics in Town. His laugh followed her to the kitchen, where she finally allowed her hands to shake as she gripped the counter. The die was cast. In 3 days, she would marry a man she'd found bleeding on her porch, a man whose business practices she despised, whose life she'd saved, and whose secrets might yet destroy them both. Thomas's ring felt like ice against her skin. "Forgive me," she whispered to the empty room. But as she touched the contract's fresh signature, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, improbably, she'd just taken the first step towards saving not just her land, but something larger than herself. The day before the wedding dawned bitter cold, the kind of morning that turned breath to ice and made old wounds ache. Sarah found James by the broken section of fence she'd been meaning to repair, his shoulder obviously paining him as he struggled with a post. "You'll tear your stitches," she called out, trudging through the snow with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Better than sitting idle while you work yourself to exhaustion." He accepted the cup gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "I've watched you these past days, you know. Up before dawn, to bed past midnight. No one could maintain that pace alone." Sarah leaned against a solid post, the broken one between them like a barrier. "I've managed 5 years. Survived, perhaps, but at what cost?" The question hung in the frozen air between them. Sarah sipped her coffee, buying time to steady her voice. "Did you check the ledger this morning?" James allowed the change of subject, though his eyes held hers a moment longer. "Yes, if someone's trying to kill me over those loans, they're doing their sums wrong. I'm losing money on half these foreclosures." "Then why continue?" "Because..." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Sometimes the machine becomes bigger than its maker. My father built this empire on handshake deals and fair terms. Somewhere along the way, it became about numbers instead of people." Sarah studied the broken fence post, its wood split by winter's fury. "Help me with this," she said suddenly, setting down her cup. Together, they worked to remove the damaged post. James proved surprisingly capable despite his injury, following her lead without the masculine posturing she'd expected. When the new post was finally secured, they stood back to admire their work. "Not bad for a banker," she admitted. "High praise from the widow who won't be bought." His smile held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "Though I suppose, after tomorrow, you'll need a new title." "I'll always be Thomas's widow," she said quietly, "just as you'll always be your father's son. But perhaps we can be something else as well. Partners." He offered the word like a peace treaty. Sarah nodded slowly. "Partners." She picked up her coffee cup, now cold. "Come on. If we're to convince the town tomorrow, you should at least know how I take my coffee." They spent the remainder of the day sharing small details of their lives, the kind of things married people would know. His preference for English novels over American ones, her habit of humming hymns while she worked, the way he absently rubbed his father's compass when deep in thought. As evening approached, Sarah found herself studying his profile in the firelight, wondering what kind of man lay beneath the banker's facade. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. "Having second thoughts?" "Only about 100, she admitted, "but none better than our current plan." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Tomorrow then, partner." "Tomorrow," she agreed, and, if her heart beat a little faster at his smile, she blamed it on the coffee. A week after their hasty wedding, another storm descended on the valley, this one fiercer than the last. Sarah stood at the window, watching James struggle through the snow from the barn, his arms laden with firewood. The sight of him, this man who once conducted business in Boston's finest offices, doing manual labor on her small ranch, still, felt surreal. "The cattle are settled," he reported, stamping snow from his boots, "though that old red cow of yours gave me the evil eye." "Bessie?" Sarah helped him stack the wood. "She does that to everyone except Thomas." She froze, the name slipping out before she could catch it. But James just nodded, continuing his work. "Tell me about him, about Thomas." Sarah sank into her rocking chair, surprised by the gentle request. The ledger lay open on the table between them, its columns of figures temporarily forgotten. He was kind, she said finally. The sort of man who'd help a stranger birth a calf in the middle of the night, then refuse payment because neighbors help neighbors. She touched the ring at her throat. He taught me everything about ranching, not because he had to, but because he believed in preparing for all possibilities. He sounds like a wise man. He was? Sarah studied James's face in the firelight. Your turn. Tell me about your father. James settled into the other chair, his expression distant. Imagine a man who could shake hands on $1 million deal, then spend the afternoon teaching his son to fish. He believed character mattered more than collateral. His hand went to the compass in his pocket. The bank changed after he died. Or perhaps I changed it, trying too hard to be what others expected. The fire crackled between them, filling the thoughtful silence. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, pushing them closer to the warmth and each other. I found something, Sarah said suddenly, reaching for the ledger. Here, in the margin, these initials, RC, they appear beside every troubled loan. James leaned forward, their shoulders nearly touching as they studied the page. Rhodes Carlton. He's been pushing hardest for the foreclosures. His voice held a new edge. The same Rhodes Carlton who's been trying to buy your land and who knew exactly where you'd be riding the night you were shot. Their eyes met, the implications clear. In that moment, with the storm raging outside and secrets unfolding between them, Sarah realized something had shifted. This marriage of convenience had become a true alliance, forged in shared purpose and growing trust. We'll figure it out, James said quietly, and she knew he meant more than just the mystery of his shooting. Sarah nodded, aware of how natural it felt to sit with him like this, planning their future one page at a time. We will, she agreed. And for the first time since Thomas's death, tomorrow didn't feel like something to endure, but something to anticipate. Sarah discovered the newspaper clippings purely by accident, tucked inside James's coat as she mended a tear in the shoulder. They spilled onto the floor like autumn leaves, yellowed pages telling a story she hadn't expected. Blackwood Ear. Champions small farmers, one headline proclaimed, dated 3 years ago. Others followed. James Blackwood opposes railroad land grab, and banking scion calls for reform. Finding some light reading? James stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. You were fighting for the farmers, Sarah said softly. Before I became everything I once opposed? He crossed to the fireplace, staring into the flames. My father's death changed everything. The board of directors, our major investors, they all had their own ideas about the bank's direction. Sarah gathered the clippings carefully. What happened? They threatened to sell their shares, which would have destroyed everything my father built. So I compromised. A little at first, then more. His laugh held no humor. By the time I realized what I'd become, it seemed too late to change course. Until someone put a bullet in your shoulder. Until someone put a bullet in my shoulder, he agreed, turning to face her. And a stubborn widow dragged me out of the snow. Sarah stood, crossing to him with the clippings. The James Blackwood in these articles, he's still there. I see him when you're helping with the cattle, when you're poring over those ledgers, looking for a way to help our neighbors. Our neighbors? His voice held a note of wonder at the word. Yes, our neighbors, the people whose lives depend on the decisions we make. She placed the clippings on the mantel. You're not alone in this anymore, James. He reached for her hand, a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks. When I was lying there in the snow, I thought I saw an angel. His thumb traced patterns on her palm. Turns out I was only half wrong. James, let me finish. You saved more than my life that night, Sarah. You saved my conscience. He pulled the compass from his pocket, offering it to her. My father gave me this when I joined the bank. May you always find your way home, he said. I think he'd be glad it led me here. Sarah took the compass, its brass warm from his pocket. The needle swung true north, unwavering. We can make this right, she said, starting with Rhodes Carlton. It won't be easy. He has powerful friends. So do we. Sarah met his eyes. Every family in this valley that you've helped, every loan you've restructured, they're all watching to see if the old James Blackwood has truly returned. He stepped closer, and Sarah felt the shift in the air between them. This wasn't the careful distance of their arranged marriage, but something new, something chosen. "And what do you see?" he asked quietly. "When you look at me now," Sarah thought of Thomas's ring, still hanging at her throat. It no longer felt like a weight, but a reminder that the heart could expand in unexpected ways. "I see a man finding his way home," she whispered. The kiss, when it came, felt like a promise kept, a truth finally spoken. Outside, the winter wind sang through the valley, carrying whispers of spring and new beginnings. The first calf of spring arrived with the dawn, its wobbly legs and determined spirit a testament to new beginnings. Sarah watched from the barn door as James hung a small brass bell around its neck, a tradition she'd shared with Thomas, now transformed into something uniquely theirs. "She's strong," James said, brushing straw from his trousers as he stood. "Like her mistress." Flatterer. But Sarah smiled, remembering their kiss from the night before. They hadn't spoken of it directly, letting it settle between them like a seed taking root. "The Miller family sent word," James continued, his tone shifting to business. "They want to keep their ranch after all, now that we've adjusted their loan terms. That's 3 families this week who've changed their minds about selling." Sarah touched the bell on the calf's neck, its clear ring echoing through the barn. "Rhodes Carlton must be furious. Let him be. We've found proof of his manipulation in the ledgers. He's been deliberately targeting struggling ranches, driving up their debts so they'd be forced to sell." Sarah watched the calf nuzzle its mother, "just like he's been trying to do with my land." "Our land," James corrected gently. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "Sarah, about last night." A rider's approach interrupted them, hooves thundering across the thawing ground. Ben Turner appeared in the barn doorway, his young face flushed with excitement. "Mrs. McAllister, Mr. Blackwood, you need to see this." He thrust a telegram at them. "Just came for you, sir. From the bank's board of directors." James read it quickly, his grip tightening on Sarah's hand. "They're calling an emergency meeting. Someone's been buying up shares, threatening a takeover." "Carlton," Sarah breathed. "He's making his move." "He must have realized we were close to exposing him." James crumpled the telegram. "I have to go to Boston." "We have to go," Sarah corrected. At his surprised look, she added, "Partners, remember? In all things now." The morning sun streamed through the barn doors, catching the brass bell's surface and sending fragments of light dancing across their faces. In that moment, Sarah saw their reflection in its polished curve. Not a widow and a banker bound by circumstance, but 2 people who had chosen each other, standing together against whatever came next. "Ben!" James called, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Ride into town and book 2 tickets on the morning train. It's time to show Rhodes Carlton what happens when he threatens what's ours." The young man galloped away, leaving them alone with the new calf and the promise of battles yet to come. Sarah touched Thomas's ring one last time, then gently lifted the chain over her head. "It's time," she said softly, placing the ring in the small box where she kept her most precious mementos. James watched in silence, understanding the significance of the gesture. Outside, spring was painting the valley in shades of renewal, much like the changes blooming in their own hearts. They had moved beyond their careful arrangement into something real and vital, as natural as the changing of seasons. The calf's bell rang softly as they left the barn, its clear tone carrying across the awakening land like a beginning. The threatening letter arrived the day before they were to leave for Boston, its elegant handwriting at odds with its menacing message. Sarah found it nailed to their front door, the paper expensive and crisp despite the morning dew. "My dear Mrs. Blackwood," it began, the new name wielded like a weapon. "I trust you understand that your recent marriage has complicated matters unnecessarily. While your husband may have temporarily forgotten his obligations to his investors, I assure This oversight will soon be corrected. Consider carefully whether your small ranch is worth the consequences of continued interference in affairs beyond your understanding. It was signed, simply, R.C. He's getting desperate, James said, reading over her shoulder. Carlton's never been this direct before. Sarah folded the letter carefully. He underestimates us both if he thinks threats will work. Us both, James repeated thoughtfully. That's what truly frightens him, isn't it? Not me alone, or you alone, but what we've become together. Inside, Sarah added the letter to their growing collection of evidence against Carlton. The ranch ledger lay open on the table, its pages now filled with careful notes documenting every suspicious transaction, every pressure tactic used against their neighbors. The Turners visited while you were in town, Sarah said, indicating fresh entries in the ledger. They've been gathering stories from other families. Carlton's been doing this for years, buying debts, raising interest rates, forcing sales. But no one piece was big enough to see the whole pattern. Until now, James studied the ledger's damning collection of facts and figures. We've given people hope, Sarah. That's what makes us dangerous to him. A knock at the door interrupted them. This time it was Mary Miller, clutching her own letter from Carlton. He's threatening to call in all our loans, she said, tears in her eyes. Says the bank's changing hands and all previous arrangements are void. Sarah guided the distraught woman to a chair while James poured coffee. They listened as Mary described similar letters received by other families in the valley, each carrying the same underlying threat: submit or lose everything. We won't let that happen, James assured her, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had drawn Sarah to trust him. Carlton's power comes from keeping people isolated, afraid to stand together. But that's changing now. After Mary left, comforted by their promises of support, Sarah and James stood on the porch, watching the spring sunset paint the valley in shades of possibility. Their packed bags waited by the door for tomorrow's journey to Boston. I've been thinking, James said, pulling his father's compass from his pocket, about what you said when we first married, about this land being a trust, not just property. Sarah leaned against the porch railing, remembering that day. You thought I was naive. I thought you were right. He opened the compass, its needle pointing true as ever. My father used to say banking was about building communities, not empires. Somewhere along the way I forgot that. And now? Now I think perhaps you and Thomas had the right idea all along. A ranch, a bank, they're both about nurturing growth, supporting people through hard times and good. He closed the compass, offering it to her. Will you hold on to this for me while we're in Boston? Sarah understood the gesture for what it was, not just a practical exchange, but a promise. To help you find your way home? I'm already home, he said softly, drawing her close. You showed me that. Now it's time to show Carlton and the board what that really means. They stood together as darkness settled over the land they'd fought. So hard to protect. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight they had the strength of shared purpose and the knowledge that they faced whatever came next as true partners in every sense of the word. Boston's banking district loomed over them like a forest of stone and glass, so different from their Montana valley. Sarah watched James navigate the crowded streets with the ease of long familiarity, his banker's mask firmly in place. But she noticed how his hand kept straying to his pocket, searching for the compass she now carried. The bank's boardroom matched her imagination. All dark wood and leather, portraits of stern-faced men staring down from gilt frames. James's father was among them, she noticed. The same kind eyes she sometimes caught in his son's unguarded moments. Quite a change from your ranch, Mrs. Blackwood. Rhodes Carlton's voice dripped condescension as he gestured to a chair. Other board members filed in, their curious glances making it clear a rancher's widow was an unusual sight in these hallowed halls. I find the view here rather confined, Sarah replied pleasantly, noting how several directors poorly concealed their smiles. Before Carlton could respond, an elderly man entered, aided by a silver-headed cane. The board members straightened respectfully, but it was James's reaction that caught Sarah's attention. A sharp intake of breath, color draining from his face. "Uncle Marcus," he whispered. "They said you were too ill to travel." Marcus Blackwood surveyed the room with sharp eyes that belied his frail appearance. Did they now? How convenient for certain parties. His gaze fell on Carlton, who had the grace to look uncomfortable, though perhaps not as convenient as my brother's will. Mysteriously disappearing after his death. The room erupted in murmurs. Sarah reached for James's hand under the table as his uncle withdrew a document from his coat. Old, yellowed paper that drew every eye in the room. "A copy of your father's true will, James. One he entrusted to me, knowing there were those who might seek to influence you once he was gone." Marcus placed the will on the table. He saw what was coming, you see, the pressure they would put on you, the way they would use your sense of duty against you. James reached for the document with trembling hands. Sarah read over his shoulder, her heart pounding as the truth unfolded in precise legal language. James's father had indeed left him the bank, but with specific provisions protecting small farmers and ranchers, provisions that had been deliberately hidden to force James into a more aggressive lending policy. "You knew," James's voice was deadly quiet as he looked at Carlton. "You knew what my father wanted, and you conspired to hide it." "The bank needed a firmer hand," Carlton argued. "Your father's soft-hearted policies were building communities instead of destroying them," Sarah interrupted. From her bag, she withdrew their carefully annotated ledger. "We have proof of how you've manipulated loans, forced foreclosures, all while buying up the distressed properties through shell companies." She began laying out documents, bank records, property deeds, witness statements from families across the territory. Months of careful investigation spread across the polished table like a spider's web, with Carlton at its center. "And when James began to question your methods," she continued, producing the threatening letter, "you tried to have him killed, but you failed to account for one thing. The widow who wouldn't sell," Carlton sneered. "No." Sarah placed James's father's compass beside the evidence. A man's ability to find his way home to who he really is. The next hour passed in a blur of revelations. Other board members, seeing which way the wind blew, quickly distanced themselves from Carlton's schemes. Marcus Blackwood called for an immediate vote to remove Carlton from the board and freeze all questionable foreclosure proceedings. But it was the discovery in Carlton's private office that proved most damning. Hidden in a false drawer, they found the original letter from James's would-be assassin, along with receipts for payment. The man's name hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You know him?" James asked, seeing her reaction. "He worked for Thomas," she whispered. "The winter before the accident. He was fired for stealing." She met James's eyes. "The day you were shot. The tracks I followed to find you, I thought they looked familiar." Understanding dawned in James's face. "Carlton didn't just want me dead. He wanted you blamed for it. The widow with a grudge against the bank, harboring a secret killer. But he didn't count on you saving me instead." James touched her cheek, gently. "Or on us discovering the truth together." As they emerged from the bank that evening, the setting sun painted the city's windows in shades of gold. Sarah felt the weight of James's father's compass in her pocket, its needle pointing west, toward home. "What happens now?" she asked as they walked arm in arm through the bustling streets. James smiled, looking more like the man from those old newspaper clippings than ever. "Now we do what my father always intended. We help build something worth preserving. Together." Sarah thought of their valley, of new calves and mending fences, of neighbors helping neighbors through hard times. She thought of Thomas's dream and how it had grown into something larger than herself. And she thought of love, how it could surprise you with second chances when you least expected them. Together, she agreed, and felt the compass warm against her heart, guiding them home. The return to Montana brought fresh challenges. While Carlton sat in a Boston jail awaiting trial, his web of influence stretched far into the territory. Sarah and James spent long evenings poring over a weather-worn map of the valley, marking the properties where Carlton's allies still held power. "His men won't give up easily," James said, tracing the network of connected ranches. "They've invested too much in this land grab to surrender without a fight." Sarah nodded, remembering the determined look in Carlton's eyes, even as he was led away. "He told his foreman something before they took him. I couldn't hear the words, but you recognized the look," James finished. "The same one he had when he ordered my shooting." They'd received word that morning that Carlton's former assassin had been found dead in his cell, secrets dying with him. Now smoke signals of trouble rose across the valley, cattle gone missing, fences mysteriously cut, midnight riders spotted near vulnerable homesteads. "They're trying to frighten people into selling before the bank's new policies take effect," Sarah said, marking another threatened ranch on the map. "Make them think Carlton's protection is better than our promises." James studied the map's annotations, his father's compass open beside it. "They're targeting the properties that form a corridor through the heart of the valley. With those lands controlled, they could squeeze everyone else out," Sarah finished. She traced the line of threatened ranches, seeing the pattern emerge. "And our ranch sits right in the middle of their plan." A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Old Turner entered, his face grave. "You've got visitors coming." Jake Carlton and a dozen riders, armed for bear. "Rhodes's brother." James's hand went to his healing shoulder. "Right on schedule." Sarah was already moving, retrieving the rifle Thomas had taught her to use. "Get word to the neighbors. Anyone who stood with us against Carlton will be a target." Turner nodded. "Already done. The Millers and Johnsons are bringing their families here. Others are gathering at the church." "Good." James rolled up the map, his banker's refinement giving way to the rancher he'd become. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less." After Turner left, Sarah and James stood in the fading light, the gravity of their situations settling around them. Everything they'd built, every family they'd helped, every promise of a better future, it all hinged on what happened next. "Sarah," James took her hands in his, "you could still leave. Take the evidence to the federal marshal in Helena." She silenced him with a kiss, fierce and certain. "My home, our home. We defend it together." He pressed his forehead to hers, their breath mingling in the cool evening air. "I love you," he said softly. "Not because of contracts or laws or convenience, because you showed me what it means to fight for something larger than myself." "I love you too," she whispered back, the words feeling as natural as breathing. "Now help me barricade these windows. We've got a home to protect." They worked quickly, efficiently, their movements synchronized by months of shared labor. As the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah caught James watching her with a mix of pride and wonder. "What?" "Just thinking about the first time I saw you," he said, securing another window, "standing over me with a rifle and a scowl, deciding whether to save my life." "Best decision I ever made," she replied, checking her ammunition. Outside, horses approached through the gathering dusk. Sarah touched Thomas's ring box one last time, then took her position by the window. James stood beside her, their shadows merging on the cabin wall. The storm was coming, but this time they would weather it together. Jake Carlton's voice carried across the yard, sharp as a whip crack in the evening air. "Come out, Blackwood. Time to settle accounts." Sarah felt James tense beside her, but his voice remained steady. "Your brother's already settling his accounts. With the law." "The law?" Jake's laugh held no humor. "Out here, we make our own law. Ask your wife about that. Or should I say, the widow who trapped you with an old territorial statute." The gathered families shifted uneasily in the darkened house. Sarah touched James's arm, steadying him. "He's trying to provoke you," she whispered. "Don't give him what he wants." James nodded, then called out, "Last chance, Carlton. Ride away now, and we'll let the courts handle this." The answer came in a hail of gunfire. Bullets splintered wood and shattered windows as the families huddled behind barricades. Sarah's father's old rifle felt solid in her hands as she took careful aim at the shadows moving through her garden. "They're trying to reach the barn," Miller shouted from his position. "Not my cattle," Sarah muttered, squeezing the trigger. A cry of pain suggested her aim held true. James moved like a man transformed, coordinating their defense with the same precision he'd once applied to banking ledgers. "Johnson, watch the back door. Turner, cover that break in the fence." More riders emerged from the darkness, their shapes ghostly in the moonlight. Sarah's world narrowed to the rhythm of load, aim, fire, each shot a declaration. Not my home, not my people, not this time. A bullet whizzed past her ear, and James pulled her down just as wood splinters exploded where her head had been. Their eyes met in the chaos, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in a heartbeat. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she confirmed. They moved as one toward the back door, where the sounds of breaking wood suggested a new threat. Sarah reached it first, rifle ready, as two of Carlton's men burst through. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Sarah saw the flash of a revolver, heard James shout her name. But before either gunman could fire, a massive shape barreled into them from behind. "Nobody threatens my neighbors," Ben Turner's young voice rang out as he swung a piece of firewood like a club. His intervention gave Sarah and James the seconds they needed to level their weapons. "Drop them," James commanded. Every inch the banker's son turned rancher. "Your boss is finished, and you know it." Outside, more shouts erupted, but these were different. The thunder of approaching hooves heralded the arrival of the marshal's posse, summoned by the neighbors' foresight. "Federal marshals!" A voice boomed across the yard. "Drop your weapons!" The fight drained from Carlton's men like water from a broken bucket. Jake's voice rose in frustration. Pull back, damn you all!" But it was too late. The marshals had the ranch surrounded, and in the growing light of dawn, the would-be invaders found themselves facing not just the law, but the united front of an entire community. Sarah watched from her porch as Jake Carlton was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of impotent rage. Around the yard, neighbors embraced, checking on each other's wounds and sharing quiet words of relief. James found her there, his shirt dusty and torn, but his eyes bright with triumph. "The marshal says they've arrested Carlton's other conspirators. In town, it's over, is it?" Sarah leaned against him, suddenly exhausted. "There'll still be people who want to take advantage, who think profit matters more than community." "Yes," James wrapped an arm around her waist, "but now they know this valley stands together, like your Thomas taught you, like my father wanted for the bank, neighbors helping neighbors." Sarah surveyed her damaged but standing home, the barn, where a new calf waited to be fed, the land that had sustained so many dreams. "We'll need to mend a lot of fences," she said, unconsciously echoing their first real conversation. "Good thing we've had practice," James replied, and kissed her. As the sun rose over their shared valley, painting everything in the colors of a hard-won dawn. Dawn revealed the full extent of the night's chaos. Bullet holes riddled the cabin's front, the garden lay trampled, and spent cartridges glinted in the morning light like scattered seeds. But as Sarah moved through the familiar rooms, she found something unexpected amid the destruction. Signs of life renewed. Mrs. Miller was already sweeping broken glass, her youngest daughter carefully collecting the shards in a bucket. Ben Turner and his father worked to patch the broken windows, while James helped the Johnson boys right the overturned furniture. The morning sun streamed through the damaged walls, casting patterns on the floor that seemed to dance with their movements. "Found something?" James called from the porch, holding up a tarnished piece of metal. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the locket she'd thought lost in the fighting, a family heirloom from her mother. "It's broken," she said softly, taking it from him. The clasp had been crushed, perhaps by a stray boot in the chaos. "Not broken," James corrected, pulling a small tool from his pocket. "Just needs mending, like everything else." They sat together on the porch steps, watching their neighbors work, while James carefully straightened the locket's hinges. The steady rhythm of hammers and saws filled the air, punctuated by calls for nails or wood or coffee. "I've been thinking," James said, his hands never pausing in their delicate work, "about what you said when we first married, about this land being a trust." Sarah nodded, remembering that day that seemed so long ago now. "You thought I was naive. I thought you were right." He tested the locket's clasp. "My father understood. It too, a bank, a ranch, a community. They're all built on trust. Break that and everything falls apart, like Carlton tried to do. Like Carlton failed to do," James corrected, smiling as the locket finally clicked open. Inside, the tiny photographs remained undamaged. Sarah's parents on one side, Thomas on the other. Sarah touched Thomas's image gently. "There's room," she said, "on the other side, for new memories." James understood. He always did now. "Are you sure? Thomas taught me that love isn't a finite thing to be hoarded or divided. It grows." She looked out at their neighbors working together, at the land that had brought them all together. Like trust, like community. A commotion from the barn drew their attention. The Miller children came running, excitement brightening their dust-streaked faces. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood, come quick, the new calf, she's trying to stand." Together, they followed the children to the barn. The calf from earlier that week wobbled on spindly legs, its mother watching proudly. The brass bell around its neck caught the morning light, ringing softly with each uncertain step. "She's doing it," young Mary Miller exclaimed as the calf found its balance. "Just like Pa said, you fall down, you get back up." Sarah felt James's arm slip around her waist, solid and sure. Around them, the work continued, neighbors helping neighbors, just as it had always been, just as it would always be. The bullet holes would be patched, the gardens replanted, the fences mended, and something new would grow from the effort, something stronger than before. "I love you," James said quietly, for her ears alone. "Not because of laws or circumstances, but because you showed me what it means to build something worth fighting for." Sarah leaned into him, watching the calf take its first confident steps. The repaired locket hung warm against her heart, old memories and new possibilities contained within its mended clasp. "We all need help finding our way home sometimes," she replied, thinking of his father's compass, of Thomas's lessons, of all the paths that had led them here. "I'm glad you found yours with me." Outside, the sound of hammers and saws continued as their neighbors rebuilt what Carlton's men had tried to destroy. But here in the barn, watching new life take its first steps, Sarah and James held each other and knew that some things couldn't be broken by bullets or greed. Trust, love, community, hope. These were the true foundations of home. Spring brought changes to the valley as sudden and complete as the winter's retreat. With Carlton and his conspirators awaiting trial in Boston, James threw himself into restructuring the bank's lending practices, while Sarah coordinated the shared labor that had become commonplace among their neighbors. They stood together one morning in the branding corral, watching as their ranch hands prepared to mark the new calves. James held up the branding iron, its design still cooling from the forge. A fusion of their separate brands into something new. "Sure about this?" he asked, though his smile suggested he already knew her answer. Sarah traced the interwoven letters with her finger. "The Blackwood McAllister brand has a certain ring to it." "Like its owner," James replied, touching her wedding ring. Not Thomas's, but the one they'd chosen together after the fighting ended. The simple gold band caught the morning light, much like the brass compass that now hung beside her mended locket. Their first calf approached the corral, its mother watching anxiously from nearby. The bell around its neck rang with each determined step, no longer wobbling but strong and sure. "Do the honors." James offered her the iron. Sarah took it, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about marking cattle, it was about marking a new chapter in their lives. The brand pressed clean and true, healing even as it marked, just as time had healed and marked them both. "You've got visitors!" Ben Turner called from the fence. They turned to see Uncle Marcus making his way toward them, leaning on his cane. but moving with more vigor than he'd shown in Boston. "Wanted to see this new operation of yours for myself," the old man declared, surveying the scene with sharp eyes. "The board's talking about using your lending model across all our territories. The Blackwood method, they're calling it." "The Blackwood-McAllister method," James corrected, drawing Sarah closer. Marcus nodded approvingly. "Your father would be proud, son, both of you. Speaking of which," he withdrew an envelope from his coat. "The final paperwork from Boston. Everything Carlton touched has been reviewed and restructured." Sarah opened the envelope, scanning the documents inside. Page after page of restored deeds, adjusted loans, and renewed hope for families across the territory. Their neighbors would keep their lands, their dreams intact. "There's more," Marcus added. "The bank's establishing a new branch here in the valley. We need someone who understands both banking and ranching to run it. Someone who knows the value of building community." James looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She smiled, understanding immediately. The old Wilkins place would make a fine bank building, close enough to manage both operations. "Partners in all things?" James asked softly. "Partners in all things," she confirmed. As if to seal the moment, a chorus of bells rang out across the pasture. Not just their first calf now, but a dozen others, each wearing the brass symbol of new beginnings. The sound carried across the valley like hope made musical. "Your father had a saying," Marcus said to James as they watched the cattle move across the spring grass. "Banking isn't about money, it's about faith. Faith in people, in community, in tomorrow." "Thomas used to say something similar," Sarah added. "A ranch isn't about cattle, it's about roots, the ones we put down and the ones we help others grow." James squeezed her hand. "Wise men, both of them, showing us the way home even now." Together they stood in the morning sun, watching their shared legacy take shape. The new brand marked not just their cattle but their future. Two separate stories merged into one, stronger for the joining, and across the valley bells rang out like promises kept, like love renewed, like hope taking root in fertile soil. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Sarah sat in Thomas's old chair, now James's favorite reading spot, watching her husband add their names to the family Bible. His precise banker's hand filled the space below Thomas's entry, not erasing the past, but adding to its story. "The Reverend asked if we'll host the harvest celebration this year," James said, carefully blotting the ink. "Seems our ranch has become something of a gathering place." "Seems it has," Sarah agreed, thinking of the steady stream of neighbors who now stopped by the newly established bank office on their property, staying for coffee and conversation long after their business was concluded. Through the window, she could see the fruits of their shared vision. The old Wilkins place had been transformed into a proper bank building, its fresh paint matching the new fence that connected it to their ranch. Inside, ledgers balanced both money and community, while outside, cattle wearing their merged brand grazed contentedly. "Look what Ben brought by," James said, pulling a newspaper from his desk. The headline made her smile. "Blackwood-McAllister banking model spreads, a new era of community finance." "Uncle Marcus must be pleased," Sarah mused, remembering the old man's recent visit. He'd stood on their porch, watching the valley's evening activities with satisfied eyes, and declared that banking had finally remembered its heart. James set down his pen and joined her by the window. "I had a letter from Elizabeth yesterday. She's finally accepted that Boston won't be seeing her sister again." Sarah hummed, leaning into him. "Not unless Boston comes to us. Though I suspect she'll change her mind about visiting once she hears our news." His hand found her waist, resting gently over the secret they'd only recently confirmed. "A new chapter for the family Bible," he said softly. Beyond their window, life flowed with the rhythm they'd helped create. The Miller children rode past, leading their horses to the creek. Ben Turner waved from the bank's front porch, where he'd recently started apprenticing under James. Their first calf, now grown, grazed nearby, its brass bell catching the afternoon sun. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah asked, "what Thomas and your father would make of all this?" James considered the question, his hand moving to the compass that now hung permanently beside her locket. "I think they helped guide us here, in their own ways. Thomas taught you the heart of ranching. My father taught me the soul of banking. Together, we found a way to honor both." Sarah touched the family Bible, its pages containing not just names, but the story of a valley's transformation. "We're building something they'd be proud of." "We're building something everyone can be proud of," James corrected gently. "A place where neighbors help neighbors, where profit follows community instead of the other way around." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mary Miller, clutching a ledger and wearing the serious expression of a young girl, determined to learn banking from the ground up. Sarah smiled, recognizing in her young friend's enthusiasm the same spirit that had driven her own journey from widow to partner in all things. "Come in, Mary," James called, "ready to learn about compound interest. And maybe stay for supper," Sarah added, knowing the girl's mother would be by later with fresh bread to trade for the lesson. As James began explaining interest rates to his eager student, Sarah returned to the window, one hand resting unconsciously over their growing secret. The valley stretched before her, golden in the late afternoon light, every acre a testament to what people could build together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to balance banking with ranching, profit with community, past with future. But tonight, watching her husband teach a neighbor's child about the true meaning of investment, Sarah knew they'd found something rare and precious. A legacy worth more than gold, built on trust, sustained by love, and enriched by the bonds between people who chose to face life's storms together. Winter returned to the valley, but this time it brought no threats, only the quiet peace of snow falling on familiar ground. Sarah stood on her porch, one hand resting on her growing belly, the other holding a gift-wrapped package she'd been saving for the perfect moment. James emerged from the barn, his breath frosting in the cold air. Like that first fateful night, snow dusted his shoulders, but now he walked with purpose, strength, and belonging. "Merry Christmas," Sarah said softly, offering him the package. Inside lay a new compass, its brass surface gleaming. The inscription caught the morning light. "You've helped us all find our way home." James traced the words with gentle fingers, then pulled her close. Behind them, the cabin door stood open, warm light spilling out. Through the window, they could see the family Bible on its stand, their merged names written in permanent ink, with space below for the new story growing. Beneath Sarah's heart, the valley stretched before them, peaceful under its blanket of snow. From the bank building came the sound of carols as neighbors gathered for the holiday. A bell rang clear and true, their first calf's offspring, wearing their merged brand, carrying forward a legacy built on love, trust, and the simple truth that home isn't just a place, but a promise kept, a dream shared, a love chosen. "Ready?" James asked, offering his arm. Sarah smiled, tucking both old and new compasses into her pocket. "Ready." Together they walked toward the gathering, their footprints merging in the fresh snow, writing the next chapter of their ever-unfolding story.